Hello and welcome to Rachel's Atelier. I am Rachel and today I'm going to be working on a really quick Impressionist oil landscape. And this is actually going to be a sketch for a commission that I'm going to be working on. I previously, in my last video, I did this same sketch in watercolor, and I decided that I might want to just do a small oil painting too. I'm only going to give myself a maximum of 1 hour to do this, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. But first I want to show you what's on my palette because I know it's not going to be easy to get that in the screen. So first of all, I'm going to be using Oleo gel. I'm going to be using this in this painting just so that this painting dries a little bit faster because I'm running short on space in my house to dry paintings. Then I have my titanium white. This is cadmium yellow light. And then this is a cadmium yellow hue that's a little bit warmer. And then this is permanent rose, French ultramarine blue, and raw umber. So it's a limited palette, and normally when I do a limited palette, I only use one yellow, but because there is going to be some brighter greens in this, the cadmium yellow light is a little bit more optimal for that purpose. And this board that I'm using, this is oops, I got a little bit of my tea on there, sorry. This is a hardboard. And what I do is I go to my local hardware store and they have sheets of hardboard in the lumber department. It's usually in 4-foot by 8-foot sheets, but my particular lumber store will actually cut these down. And so I have them cut these down to various sizes. I think this is 8 inches this way, 10 inches that way. And that's really a nice way to practice painting cheaply, and these are great for painting outdoors too. So I use these a lot as one of my substrates, though I use other substrates as well. And then all you need to do is prime this. I sand it and then I use an acrylic primer, and you can use acrylic primers, or also known as gesso, to prime for oil paintings. All right. There's also oil primer, but I have not used that at this point. And then I have 3 brushes here. I don't know if I'll use them all, but I have my really cheap small filbert brush that I like to use for sketching. It's a size 6. And then I have a Da Vinci Bright size 8, and this is from their Impasto line, and I really like these bristles a lot. They're pretty soft, so I'll probably do maybe some detail work with that. And then this is also a Da Vinci size 12, and this is from their Plein Air line, and I believe that this is also a bright or a flat. I kind of have a hard time telling the difference between brights and flats. And then of course my palette knife. So let's get started. I'm gonna try to quickly sketch this in, and I'm going to use my darker colors first. I'm going to mix just a little bit of my raw umber in with some ultramarine blue, and then I will use my Oleo. And this is Oleo is from Winsor & Newton. They have a whole line of mediums under their Liquin line, Liquin, Liquin. And so a lot of people use their traditional Liquin, which is about the consistency of like linseed oil. But I have some of that, but I more commonly am using their Impasto because I like to keep my paint pretty thick, because I paint typically with an Impasto application of paint, which is where the paint is very thick. So I'm gonna just do a really basic sketch here. The biggest thing that I need to sketch is the fence. I'm gonna, at least at first, it's gonna be very, very light because I want to make sure I have the angle pretty accurate. The fence is not perfectly straight, which is actually kind of nice. And I think this angle needs to be a little sharper. There we go. And then let me see if I can just quickly show you my reference photo. So I'm just working from my tablet. This is the reference photo. So this is the composition I'm using, but my client is actually wanting fall foliage in this. And I'm just keeping this really light because I could make a mistake. This fence is white, so I don't really want to get dark pigment in there. Since I'm going to be doing this alla prima, I'm not gonna wait for it to dry and then come back in and do the fence. So I'm actually I'm gonna paint the negative space between the slats just to map them out. Again, I don't want to use too much pigment in here, even though between here it's gonna be pretty green. For some reason I find sketching with paint easier than with a pencil. I'm not sure why. But you could definitely, if you wanted to use pencil to do your sketching, you certainly can. Just keep in mind that when you go over that pencil with your paint, it's pretty much going to disappear. Or I've found that if you do your pencil sketch on your substrate and then you tone your canvas or your board or whatever you're using, your pencil will basically disappear if you're using like a thinned down paint to tone your canvas. So one thing that if you're doing that, I would recommend is to use like a spray fixative, or even just if you have hairspray, that'll work too. And just spray your pencil sketch down, and then the solvent that you use to thin down your paint to tone your canvas won't make that pencil disappear quite so much. Okay, so that's pretty much, even though there's some trees back there, I'm just going to block them in. I'm not going to worry about necessarily sketching them. So I just added a little bit more raw umber to the mix. And at this point, I think I will just put my filbert brush down and go ahead and start using my size 12 bright or flat. And I kind of want to mark this area out because there's some shadow here that's going to be under the trees. And it kind of recedes into the distance. My dogs are in the background. Right now they're just destroying one of their toys. But they might start wrestling, and when they do, it gets loud. And I'm gonna, actually for the kind of the tree lineup here, I'm gonna keep the paint pretty thin because of the fact that this is gonna be a fall scene, so I'm gonna go over this with some brighter colors. But I guess I just wanna map out where that tree line is going to be and some of the more notable trees in the scene. And that little horizon line really doesn't need to be very prominent because the horizon is basically covered up by the trees. And all the trees, because this is kind of I don't know if it's a golf course or it's like a pasture or something, but the trees are all planted sort of in a row. So the bottoms of them seem to be pretty much all lined up. Uh-oh, I might get some barking. There's not a ton of dark values in this painting to block in. But I'm not going to paint it as bright as this photo reference. It looks like the photo reference was taken on kind of a, you know, maybe summer or late spring. All the grass is very green. The sky is very, very blue. And I don't think that with the fall foliage, I think I'm gonna keep things a little bit more subdued. And let's see, let's just add some of the shadow down here. And I really am only gonna, the only time I use my raw umber is for blocking in dark values, so I don't really need to worry about saving it for any other purpose, because I don't mix it in with my other colors. It's really dark down here and up here. And I don't need to use as much of my oleo pasto in my darker values, because I find that like ultramarine blue, phthalo blue, they tend to dry a lot faster than the colors that have lighter values, like yellow takes a little bit longer. White seems to take the absolute longest. So I know I did a painting last weekend in my class as a demo, and it seemed like it was dry, and then I accidentally touched a part that had a lot of white in it, and that part was definitely not dry. So now it has a fingerprint. Okay, I better get cracking on the other parts of this since I have already taken up 12 minutes of my hour. Okay, so next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to look for the next darkest value, which is still going to be in the trees. So I'm going to just add more blue to my dark mix. But then I'm going to start warming it up. So I'm going to put in just a little red. This is going to be the shadowy areas of the trees, and I just don't want them to be a flat color. I want it to be a very cool tone, so I'm going to make sure I've got plenty of blue in there. There's also some red and some of the warm yellow. We'll see how that goes. And I didn't add any white to this. I try to stay away from my white as long as possible. And at this point, that's sort of just for the sake of retraining myself, because for a long time I really started out on my lights too soon in the painting process. And I'm kind of trying to retrain myself to not use as much white, because it kind of creates a washed out look. And I've found that the less white you use, the richer your colors remain. So for as long as I can, I'm not going to mix in any white. And so for a lot of this areas that I lighten up, I'm going to primarily rely on my yellows, because their baseline value is a lot lighter. There isn't a ton of dark in this composition. And I don't have any of my paint thinner over here with me, and I've been using, instead of like odorless mineral spirits, which is what I used for a long time, I am using citrus oils made by, the brand is Chelsea, Chelsia, and it's an oil that you can use to clean your brushes, but it's not a solvent, and so it's not toxic. Sorry, I've got some tea with me, so I'm going to try to remember to sip it. Usually I forget about my tea and it gets cold. So I'm going to start in on some of the greens. It's really, I intentionally did not use phthalo blue because phthalo blue creates a really bright, vibrant green, and I want to keep my greens pretty subdued. So I find that for that purpose, ultramarine blue is really good. And I want to just kind of use this darker green right next to my shadow. I don't really want to blend it in too much, but just so that shadow isn't so stark. And then there's a little bit of landscaping and little hills back here that I just want to create a sense of those. And also I'm going to have my grass in the foreground be a little bit more vibrant so that we can kind of create a sense of depth in this. And also this grass is like cut grass, and so there are some lines in it. So this will also help kind of just create that without making the lines overwhelming. This isn't my normal spot that I usually paint. This is actually where I sit to do watercolors, but I already had everything set up right here, and since I wanted to try to do this fast, I didn't want to move my camera and my camera holder thing. It's not a tripod, but kind of a tripod. Tripod without the legs. And I'm keeping the paint pretty thin on these because I'm going to end up going over it with brighter paint, but I just wanted I wanted there to be some consistency between the grass back here and then the grass coming forward. So I'll just kind of very lightly scribble that in. And then even up here, I'll use just a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to add more of my medium yellow to start lightening this up. And pretty soon I'm also going to be adding red to it. And then also, just so I don't forget, I do want to use some of the same greens in the trees, even though they're really going to be a fall foliage, there will still be some green. So I want to remember to add that up here. Another thing that I'm kind of training myself to do that I didn't usually do was I usually would paint the sky first, but because it's almost always a light value, it's not very conducive to working from dark to light. So more and more I'm saving the sky for when I actually get to that value. And then the only thing that I don't like about that is having to try to like paint around trees and things like that, but it's not that bad. It, I think, is one of those things that sounds harder than it really ends up being. All right. Then I also just want to kind of mix more green into these shadows, but I don't want to completely obliterate those shadows either. I really try hard because I'm trying to create an impressionist look, so I don't want to do any blending, so I'm really trying to avoid blending colors in with each other. Okay, so now I'm going to start just putting in a little bit of red, because especially in the foreground, the grass is going to have a much warmer tone. And also that will kind of create a nice color consistency between the foreground and then the foliage back there. So this is a lot of this warm tone, but it's going to kind of help create a good undertone for any paint that I put on top of it. And I don't want it to be too uniform, so I'm not going to put it all over the place, especially in between the fence posts. And I'm not gonna, even though I'm not gonna go over the fence posts, I'm not necessarily feeling like I have to be too terribly careful about it. Just don't want a lot of color in there because I'll go over it with a really light value, and I don't want anything to mix into it too much. Okay. And then let's put some of this back in the trees as well. Actually, I think I will put more red in here because that's going to be, the orange in the trees is going to be a bit darker value. I'll eventually put some yellows too and probably some brighter oranges, but for now I'm going to kind of cover up the rest of the trees with this kind of rusty red. It's basically just my medium warm yellow and permanent rose. That might be a little too bright. And I don't want all my trees to be the same, so I'm going to skip over some. And plus this is kind of, it looks like it might be kind of an evergreen tree, so it's not going to change colors anyway. And I have my watercolor in front of me too, so I'm kind of going off of that because I think I like how the foliage came out in that. There's some shrubs or something. Try not to think too much about what things are. But actually already almost out of my medium yellow. I didn't want to squeeze out too much paint today because I don't know if I'm going to have time to paint later today. I've got a lot of things going on. The last painting video I made was a farm scene, and I was kind of just putting it together for the class I'm teaching this weekend. I was going to use that as our demo, but I ended up spending like 6 hours painting it, and it almost felt a little too complicated. And I think this might actually be a better composition because we only have a limited amount of time in class. So maybe we'll end up using this. I might have to add more of that yellow, but at this point I don't need it quite yet. So I'm just using a paper towel to get the excess paint off of my brush right now, not cleaning it, and I usually don't clean it while I'm painting unless I really need to. So I'm actually going to start using more of this cool blue in the background, even though it's really bright. It's using that with the ultramarine and maybe a little bit of red, although maybe I'm not going to use red quite yet in there because I don't want it to be too warm. I think this is actually a nice cool green, and the sun is kind of hitting it anyway. I really want to do like ASMR painting videos where I just paint and I don't talk and it's really quiet, but I almost never know when I'm gonna be able to do a video like that because I don't know how much noise my dogs are gonna make. Now they're asleep, so I'm wishing that I had decided this was gonna be ASMR, although they were kind of wrestling in the beginning. Oh, they're so cute though. And I could get away from them and go paint in my basement, but because they don't like going down the steps. I feel like that's almost kind of mean. Go hide from them in the basement just because I know they're afraid of the stairs. But I could if I really wanted to. Okay, and I want even more yellow because back here there's some sunlight behind all these trees. I really like that. And again, so far I haven't used any white in this painting at all. I'm letting the value of the various colors kind of change the value overall. And one thing too that a new way that I'm kind of thinking about painting is that I don't really think necessarily about like the precise color that I'm mixing. I think in terms of what is the value, or also known as the lightness or darkness, and then what is the tone, as in, is it warm or is it cool? And so I think that's been a challenge for me to wrap my mind around that, and I think that for students, I think that's also a challenge. But I do think it is effective, especially in this style of painting, Impressionist painting, you really shouldn't necessarily worry about the precise color. And a lot of times, I guess one thing that I like most about Impressionist painting is that they take liberties with color. It's not exactly, I think it's fauvism, where the colors are completely exaggerated. I'm not really a fan of that, but I don't think that you necessarily have to stick with precise color replication, and it's a little bit more exciting to me to kind of push things. And the easiest way I've found to do that is by not really thinking about color as much as, again, just value and tone. Okay. I'm going to, some of these need even more yellow. I need to keep using my oleo pasto or it won't end up doing me a whole lot of good. And so here, even though I kind of sense lines back here, probably from where they mowed and from where shadows are coming in, I don't want lines, so I'm just gonna lightly touch my brush there, but I don't want to just create like a solid straight line. And I'm going to kind of exaggerate some of these too, some of these areas that create the perception of lines, just because I think it adds some nice movement to the painting. There's kind of a hill right here. And then, so back here in that area where it's, there's some light shining behind the shadows, I still don't want it to be quite as bright and vibrant as what's up here. So I'm gonna use that same green, but I just added a little bit, I added some other colors, and I'm just gonna lightly get some more light back here. Okay, and I'm adding in some of my dark value too, to dull that color down a little bit. It's still too bright. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna now move on to the foreground a little bit, and I do want to get more of my cadmium yellow hue, which is my warmer yellow. although I don't think I'll need much, so I'll just get out a little bit. My app stopped, so that seems to be a regular issue. I am just learning as I go with videos. So let's see, I'm going to just put in a little bit. I'm going to start adding more of the warm yellow into this so I can kind of start bringing it up to the foreground. Just want my foreground to be a lot warmer in tone. But for the sake of consistency, I want to make that transition a little bit more gradual. So we'll keep some of that bright, sunshiny green in here. And you can see that I just have a really light, I wouldn't even call this a grip on my brush, but I'm just holding it very lightly, and that keeps my brush strokes really light and soft, and so I don't interfere too much with the paint underneath, although it's totally fine if it interacts a little bit. And I haven't needed to clean my brush at all. All I've done is, if there was excess paint on there that I don't need anymore, I just used a paper towel to wipe it off. And the only time I can think of in this painting that I'm going to really want a clean brush is for the sky, because at that point, I really don't even need a super clean brush for the fence, because it's not like it's going to be a pure white fence, even though the photograph makes it look like it's really white. And that's one thing that you have to keep in mind working from photo references, is that your lightest values and your darkest values in a photograph are always going to be flatter than they would appear in life. And I think that it can be difficult to kind of keep that in mind as you're painting, but I think it's really important too, because you don't want your painting to look like a photograph. Photographs are great for certain things. Like, I've found that a scene that makes a great photograph, though, does not always make a great painting composition, because it could be too busy. So I think there's things I'm learning that you really have to keep in mind when working from photo references. But it's also, for me, it's important that I can work from photo references, because almost all of my commissions are going to be based on photo references that the clients send me. But that's something that I just keep in mind as I paint, so that it doesn't look like a photograph, or doesn't look like it came from a photograph, if that makes sense. Okay. So I'm pretty happy with the grass. There's some of it that, let's see, like the shadow I want to work on just a little bit. And the shadow in the photo is one of those things where it looks extremely almost black, but I know that it's definitely not. So I'll just mix a really dark green, and I put a little bit of red in it just so it wouldn't be like a bright green. Could be maybe a little bit darker. Now, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and block in the sky because my board is toned kind of a teal color. It almost looks okay, but it needs to be lighter, and it does need to be a little bluer, but I don't want it to be too blue. When I think of fall, I usually think of not necessarily like a gray, cloudy sky, but definitely not usually a super bright blue sky. And I think that although it can be really sunny and blue in the fall, I feel like having a really vivid blue in the sky will take away from the vibrance of the foliage. So I'm just using my ultramarine blue, and there is just a little bit of permanent rose in there just because I used a little bit of my dark mixture which had that. Let's see, oh, here's my other brush. So I have some on my palette knife, so that's what I'm going to use at first. So, but I'm not going to paint the sky like completely uniform. And before I get too close to the trees, I'm just going to block in the top part. But basically, what I'll do is I'll kind of put in this cool color, but then I want it, especially down here, maybe not so much over here, but down here I'm going to add a little bit of yellow, and it's going to be a little bit lighter. So this is the first time I'm using white in this painting, and actually I think it might even be a bit much. And I'm actually out of my ultramarine. Usually I put way too much paint on my palette, but I did not want to do that today. So I will end up not having enough. It's always going to be one or the other. Can never squeeze out just the right amount of paint. Maybe someday I'll get that good though. So I'm kind of leaving almost like a halo around the trees right now, but I won't leave it that way. I just don't want any of the paint from the trees to get into my sky and kind of pollute this color. I want to get my whole sky blocked in, and then I can kind of move the paint a little bit closer to the trees. God, I'm already at 45 minutes. Oh, it goes too fast. Okay. So I'm not adding any more blue to this, but I am going to add a little bit of white, just a tiny, tiny bit to lighten it up. And then I'm going to use just a little tiny bit of my warm yellow just to add some warmth. It's definitely not gonna look yellow, and even though this is blue mixed with yellow, it's not gonna look green. Because I have found that for the most part with ultramarine blue and the warm yellow, it kind of subdues the color. It doesn't really turn it green. You would have to use a lot more yellow to make it look green at all. And again, I don't like to blend, so I just kind of use overlapping brush strokes to kind of create a visual blend. There we go. I really like that. And I do need to get more of my ultramarine blue. And let's see, I need more oleopasto as well. I used it up. And I will want it, especially for that fence, because it's going to have a lot more white in it. And as I said, anything with a lot of white in it, it's going to take forever to dry. Okay, so I didn't clean this brush off at all, but now I'm going to just start bringing the sky and the trees together and just kind of creating a soft edge. And I think it's more effective to go into your trees and bring some of that paint up rather than trying to bring the sky down into the trees, if that makes sense. I just want to kind of create a soft edge, bringing the sky and the trees together. And then especially with these trees back here, because they're so far in the distance, we don't want any hard edges. And I'm going to be adding a lot more vibrant colors to these trees. But this kind of gets us started. Okay. And now I'm going to put this brush back down. I'm going back to my 12 size brush, and I'm going to start adding more vibrance into those trees and also here in the foreground. But this part back here, even though some of it looks a little bit rough and I might try to just kind of smooth it down a little bit, I'm going to leave it for now. All right. So now I'm going to be primarily using my light yellow. A little bit of permanent rose. The other nice thing about oleopasto, although it's kind of expensive, so I don't really necessarily think of this as a way of stretching my paint in an economic sense, but it does, because it doesn't thin your color down too much, it is pretty effective. Like if you mix a color and you just need more of it, you can use the oleopasto to make that mix go further, which is kind of nice. But a tube of oleopasto is not necessarily less expensive than a tube of most paint pigments, so I don't really think of it as saving money. Although I'm always looking for ways to save money as I paint without sacrificing quality. And these boards, like I said, are a really good economic way to practice painting. And as long as you prime them, they're perfectly archival. They're not going to deteriorate in any way. Some people paint on cardboard, and I always wonder how long and how well those paintings hold up. But hardboard is great, actually. The only downside is like if you're shipping it and you're doing like a larger size, it's significantly heavier than just using a stretched canvas. So you end up spending a little bit more on postage. And I've also found that a lot of my customers, they just don't want their paintings painted on like a wood substrate. I'm not really sure why that is, but most people, it seems, prefer stretched canvas. Eventually, soon, actually, once I use up my current supplies, I'm going to start doing a lot of my final paintings on Arches oil paper, which I have not bought yet. It's expensive. I don't necessarily, I don't know if it ends up, I should do the math and see if it ends up being less expensive than stretched canvas, which I don't make my own stretched canvases. I always just buy them. So I should see. But I think overall, like, it's easier to work with. It's easier to cut it down to a particular size that you want. Easier to ship. Can actually, if as long as the painting is completely dry, you could even roll it up and ship the painting in a tube. And I think it's also going to be easier, like if it's going to be framed, it'll be easier to find a frame for the paper, because it's just like framing any like photograph or a watercolor or anything like that. Whereas framing stretched canvases, I think, can be pretty expensive. So you have to, the frame has to have like an appropriate depth to it. But on the other hand, like if I want a painting on my wall and it's on a stretched canvas, I'll just hang it without a frame. So there's that too. But I do kind of like the idea. Actually, I've been doing a lot of my studies, still life studies, on just Canson oil paper, which I don't think is archival, so I'm not selling anything on those, on that paper, but I think it's been nice to work on. It's actually, I prefer it to the texture of these boards. So I think this tree, I want to bring more green into it. I do want it to be kind of getting some sunlight, so I added a lot of yellow, but I want to just bring in a little bit more green. And then also down here, let's see, looking at my reference and trying to see if I need to bring up my lighter yellow a little bit more, or if I need to bring down some of the darker. I think it's kind of a combination. So I'll do the darker value first. Because I can still see some of my toned surface through the bottom of these trees. And usually putting a darker value on top of lighter values is really difficult, but since I have not used any white in these trees at all so far, it's actually going okay. It's not polluting the dark value too much. But once you have white mixed in there, it just really, any darker tone you try to add to it just gets really polluted. It's amazing what you can accomplish without white. I used to buy just like tons of tubes of white, like the huge 200 milliliter tubes of white, because I would go through it so fast, and now I think that is going to change, which is awesome. And I found that the best way to really emphasize the bright, vibrant colors in a painting is to use them very sparingly. You can easily overwhelm your painting by using too much bright, vibrant colors. But when they're juxtaposed with the more neutral colors, they really pop. And that is what I like. A book that I have been slowly studying, and the only reason I even say slow is because there is so much to learn. It's not that it's uninteresting and that I'm like getting through it slowly, but I'm like, every page that I read is like I have to really think about it and how I can incorporate those principles into my paintings. Oh man, I'm already at 58 minutes and I haven't even done my fence. Go figure. Someday I'll get there and I'll be able to stick to a time frame, but the time just goes so fast. And then I'm going to kind of start creating, well, this is going to be really brown. I'm actually going to clean off my brush before I go back to the foreground. Or maybe I should go ahead and add some, yeah. I'll just do a little bit more with my trees first. I do want some red in there, just not much. So this is just permanent rose, but just a very small amount on my brush because I don't want to overwhelm anything with red. But one of my favorite things to do is to, even if I wasn't doing like a fall scene, I would probably put some little red accents in the trees because it creates a nice contrast with the green. It makes the green seem even greener somehow. Complementary colors. Like this tree really doesn't have any changing leaves, but I just want to put a little bit of red into the shadow area. but I haven't mixed this red in with anything. It's just kind of visually mixing in with the paint underneath it. And just adding some very subtle interest. But I'm not, these trees back here, I'm gonna leave any warm colors out of them because adding warm colors tends to bring things, make them seem like they're more in the foreground. So those trees back there are going to just stay as they are. Very cool in tone. And also very cool. Okay, and then I think the last thing I'll do to these trees, and I have not used any white in them at all, is just to add a little bit more yellow. Very, very subtly though. Kind of in that same manner that I just did with the red. I'm going to have very little on my brush. And it's just going to be a few accents here and there. That's actually, I think, too much up in here, so I'll fix that in just a minute. And again, the trees, as they recede into the background, I just won't use any yellow at all. Like on that one, I'm just not going to. And you want to definitely avoid having, you know, a vibrant yellow right next to a vibrant red, because it, to me, looks like ketchup and mustard. So where there's more red, I'm going to not let my yellow be quite as vibrant. Now, I'm going to leave the trees alone for now. I'm going to work a little bit more on the foreground, just to, because I feel like it's a little too dull compared to the grass that's behind it. But I want it to be warmer than the grass that's behind it. So I'll use both my yellows actually. I want some texture up here, more so than in the background. And also between the fence. And I don't necessarily want the greens back here to be flat, but because they're further away from our eye, I just don't want them to have nearly as much texture as this grass down here. And I'm just starting to kind of carve out my fence a little bit. Doesn't have to be perfect though. I'm going to go back in with some of my darker value too to create more texture in here. I like to leave a lot of brush strokes in my paintings. The more the better. So as I'm kind of getting closer to the point where I'll be done with the grass, I'm gonna just really apply the paint very thick. If you apply the paint too thick too fast, however, it makes it difficult to put more paint on top. So if you're gonna paint in an impasto style with really thick paint and leaving lots of brush strokes, just keep that in mind to save those brush strokes for last. I'm just kind of looking to see, I think there are some areas back there that need to, there's some kind of tall grass back there. And I wonder, like, I'm almost tempted to add a little bit of white to it, but I'm gonna see if I can avoid that. There, that looks pretty good actually. And then, looks like I've lost some of the lines I was trying to create back there too. Like this one, I think is the most important one. It adds a lot of movement. And this area looks just a little weird right now because I haven't added the trunks of the trees yet. And actually, so one thing that's kind of bothering me is I feel like the foreground and then this middle ground are not differentiated enough. And so I actually think that I should add a little bit of white back here. So I'm gonna mix up some of that brighter green again though. I'll add just a tiny, tiny bit of white. So just, I'm not getting the sense that it's pushed back enough. There we go. I think that's gonna help. There was too much vibrancy. But you can always go lighter in oil painting. It's easier to add the lighter tones on. It's a lot harder if you need to go darker, so. This was an easy problem to solve. And I'm just kind of going back over some of these areas with the really bright yellow, just kind of taking that out a little bit. As we get closer, I can leave more of it in though. Okay, that's better. That's way better. Okay. And I used up all my oleo pasto again. Goodness. But the worst is having too much of that stuff on your palette. And if you leave that on your palette overnight, it will dry up and it will be wasted. So I guess it's better to have to add it than to end up with too much. If that happens, I'll just force myself to do another painting and use it up. Okay, I think I'll start working on the fence. I just realized that my tea is now completely cold. So I'm going to use the same light blue that I used in the sky, but I'm going to add some of my warmer tones to it to get the fence started. And I'll put just a tiny bit more white. I just don't want it to be too white. Okay, so it's about like this. It's kind of a neutral and it's not super light, but for these, the fence post back here, I don't want it to be very light. I'm gonna move my palette out of the way because I'm gonna put my elbow down. And I've ruined so many clothes by dipping my arm into my paint. So I'm just blocking this in, but I'm, again, like when I was putting the sky around the trees, I'm not going to get too close yet to the grass, just because I don't want to pollute this light color in with the grass. So I'm leaving some space. And then once I have it blocked in, I can go back and push it outwards. And you can definitely see that even though this is not a super, it's not white, but it definitely is a lot lighter than what's around it. And I don't know if I mentioned, but I did switch over to my smaller brush, my number 8, and it also has softer bristles. The number 12 brush has pretty coarse bristles. I don't need a lot there. Actually, I need to bring it down here. And I'm doing this pretty crudely. Especially, I mean, this is just a sketch. When I do the final painting, it'll be significantly larger. And so I'll pay more attention to the actual structure of the fence. I just want to get a basic sense of this composition with the sketch. Kind of, I think what I really wanted to focus on was the color of the trees, since my photo reference, the colors don't reflect quite the colors that my client wants. So I'll do this sketch and then I'll kind of, probably won't start on the final painting today because I want to kind of just think about this process and any changes I might make to improve on it. Do you know that gnats and like little bugs are attracted to the linseed oil in oil paint? And that, so I just noticed a little gnat flying around, which made me think of that. But that is the most annoying thing about trying to paint outside, is you just get bombarded with little tiny bugs, especially here where I live, and especially in the evening. It is just awful. And I was kind of trying to do some research online the other day to see if there's any way, like any other medium that you can mix in with your oil paint to make the bugs less attracted to the paint, because they literally fly not just into the paint on your palette, but they fly directly into your painting, and then you just have like a bunch of little bug bumps all over the place in your painting, and it stinks. Especially if you actually paint something that you really like, you forever have bugs in there. And since I paint really thick, it's like trying to get them out is basically just to ruin the whole painting. Totally stinks. So I'm mixing up, I'm trying to make this just a little bit warmer. I don't necessarily need it to be lighter in value, but just warmer in tone for the fence closer to the viewer. And that's just kind of a subtle thing that I like to do to help create the sense of depth. Just don't want it to be overwhelming. Okay, that looks pretty good. And I don't really want this paint to be too terribly thick at this point because I need to add just some little shadows. As well. And the shadows are so small, I didn't want to put them on first and then try to work around them. So we'll see how that goes. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the shadows. They were kind of frustrating me when I was doing my watercolor sketch. We'll see if I handle them better now. And even though this is like a man-made object and the lines are really straight, I still don't want, I want it to still kind of be soft when it comes to where it merges with the grass, but at this point I'm keeping my lines pretty straight and separate from the background. And I'm kind of painting this as just one big solid mass, just so I can get the structure right so it looks solid. If you were to try to paint something like this where there's a lot of different segments, if you tried to paint each segment one at a time, the structure would end up looking a little bit wonky. Okay, so I don't know if it's like visible on camera, but I really like how this is just a little bit cooler. This is a little bit warmer. That's not really reflected in the photo reference, but I like it. So I just try to, it's little things like that I just try to keep in mind as I paint. So I'm gonna just start kind of pushing the grass actually into the fence just a little bit. And just to kind of create a soft look. I don't like hard lines very much, even when it comes to man-made things. And that too, with photos, the edges tend to be very crisp. But the thing I like about paintings is the softness. So I am going to just soften these lines. Also, when I do the final painting, I'm going to be a lot, especially of the final layers, or final part of my process for that, I'll actually be using a palette knife to apply a lot of the paint, because that is just kind of part of my impasto process. So there definitely, especially up here, there's going to be a lot of thick paint, and thin lines are not going to be a priority, or straight, solid lines. So you can either push the grass into the fence a little, or the fence into the grass, and I think it just kind of depends on what is working in that moment. And especially around these posts, I really don't want a solid line because the grass is going to be kind of growing up over the post in front of it anyway. And And that is just the way it should be. And I'm not even really applying any pressure, like just the bare minimum amount of pressure with my brush. So it's just kind of barely touching the painting at this point. Oh man, hour and 32 minutes. Oops. At least my recording hasn't stopped again. So much for my 1 hour goal though. Okay, so now just going to add a little bit of the shadows. There's not a lot as far as shadows on the fence. So I'm going to use some of that warm tone right there and mix in more blue and more, I should say ultramarine blue, although that's the only blue in my canvas right now. And then a little bit more permanent rose. And this is pretty dark, but it's gonna end up blending in with the light color underneath it, so that's it. And I'm just gonna block it in right now, just get it placed. Just, even though this fence doesn't have a lot of texture in it, I just feel like it looks way too flat. So I'm just very subtly putting in some texture. I just want to, again, kind of break up some of the lines that I've created, because I only just need the suggestion of most of these lines. I don't need them to be quite so stark. So kind of my first thought on this, kind of, you know, thinking about the final painting, is the grass is too green. That stands out to me the most. And I'm not going to work on that right now, but that's definitely one thing that I think is taking away from the sense that this is autumn. So the green in my watercolor painting I thought worked actually a lot better, even though it seems, actually, I'm looking at it and it actually looks a little bit even more vibrant than this. But maybe, I don't know, I need more yellow in here. It's just way too much green. Fix that, and I'm gonna call this sketched. It's done. So next step will be the final painting, which I'll probably do tomorrow. So thank